I thought losing my health would be the hardest thing I would ever face. I was wrong. The hardest thing was watching my family stop pretending they loved me. The day my doctor called with the test results, the sky above Atlanta was the color of wet concrete. I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. At 72 years old, I had buried a husband, survived years of long workdays as a school principal, and rebuilt my life more than once. I thought I was prepared for bad news. I wasn't. "Mrs. Brooks, we need to discuss the next steps," the doctor said gently. Those words stayed with me during the entire drive home. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every mile felt heavier. My small brick house had never looked so quiet. The wind moved through the oak trees in my front yard, and for the first time in years, I felt truly alone. I sat at my kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. My late husband, Walter, used to sit across from me every morning. Even after 6 years, I could still picture him there, newspaper folded under one arm, smiling as if everything would somehow work out. That afternoon, I didn't tell anyone about my diagnosis. Not right away. I needed time to process it myself. But news travels in families faster than people admit. Somehow, before sunset, my phone began ringing. First it was my son Darren. Then my daughter-in-law Monique. Then my granddaughter. Then relatives I hadn't heard from in months. Everyone wanted to know how I was feeling. Everyone suddenly seemed concerned. Darren insisted on stopping by after work. Monique brought homemade soup the very next day. My granddaughter offered to help clean the house. The attention was overwhelming. For years, family gatherings had become shorter. Phone calls had become less frequent. Holidays often felt rushed. Yet now, suddenly, I was surrounded by concern. At first, I was touched. I told myself I was lucky. Many people face illness completely alone. Maybe difficult news had reminded my family of what truly mattered. Maybe this was what families were supposed to do. Maybe love had simply found its way back home. A week later, Darren arrived carrying grocery bags filled with fresh produce and expensive vitamins. He hugged me longer than usual. Monique organized my medication on the kitchen counter and insisted on attending future appointments. They smiled constantly. They spoke softly. They asked if I needed anything. Looking back, I should have noticed how often their questions drifted away from my health. I should have wondered why conversations about treatment somehow became conversations about finances, about paperwork, about long-term plans. But grief has a way of clouding judgment. Fear does too. I wanted to believe the best about my family. I wanted to believe that illness had brought us closer together. That evening, after they left, I stood at the living room window watching their SUV disappear down the street. My heart felt lighter than it had in days. For the first time since receiving the diagnosis, I felt hopeful. I didn't know that somewhere between those smiles and those comforting words, something far darker had already begun. And I had no idea that my illness wasn't the story that was about to change my life. My family was. The following weeks felt strangely peaceful. Every morning, I would wake up to text messages from Darren asking how I had slept. Monique called almost daily to check on my appointments, my medications, and my energy levels. If someone had shown me this version of my family a year earlier, I would have thought I was looking at strangers. For so long, I had learned not to expect much. Holidays came and went. Birthdays were often squeezed between other plans. Conversations felt rushed. Yet now, suddenly, I was the center of everyone's attention. One Saturday afternoon, Darren arrived carrying 2 large bags from a grocery store across town. He filled my refrigerator with fresh fruit, vegetables, bottled water, and foods he claimed would help me stay strong. I stood in my kitchen watching him move from shelf to shelf. For a moment, he reminded me of the little boy who used to help me carry groceries into the house after school. That memory warmed me more than I wanted to admit. Monique soon became even more involved. She created a color-coded calendar for my appointments. She offered to organize medical paperwork. She even purchased a large binder with dividers labeled insurance, prescriptions, specialists, and future planning. Future planning. I noticed those words but did not think much about them at the time. I was too grateful for the help. Living alone becomes different when health problems enter the picture. Simple tasks suddenly take longer. Decisions feel heavier. Having people around felt comforting. At least at first. Then little things began to stand out. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. One afternoon, while helping me sort documents, Monique paused over a property tax statement. She studied it longer than necessary. "This neighborhood has become incredibly valuable," she said casually. I nodded and continued sorting papers. Another day, Darren asked whether I still kept a safe deposit box at the bank. The question seemed harmless. Still, it lingered in my mind long after he left. A few days later, Monique asked if I had updated my estate documents recently. She smiled while asking, but something about the timing felt unusual. Every conversation seemed to circle back to paperwork. To records. To assets. To plans for the future. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, responsible adults discuss these matters. Especially when a loved one faces health challenges. Yet the pattern continued. The concern for my well-being always seemed genuine. But beneath it ran another current. Quiet. Steady. Difficult to ignore. One evening, I hosted a family dinner. Nothing fancy. Just baked chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and peach cobbler. The dining room felt full again. Laughter echoed through the house. For a little while, I allowed myself to believe everything was finally returning to normal. Then my grandson looked up from his plate and asked a question that froze the entire table. "Dad, when Grandma dies, do we get the big house?" Silence crashed into the room. Darren nearly dropped his fork. Monique forced a quick laugh and changed the subject. Everyone moved on. Everyone except me. Because in that single moment, something inside me shifted. And for the first time, I began to wonder what conversations were happening when I was not in the room. After that dinner, I could not stop thinking about my grandson's question. Children often say what adults try very hard to hide. They repeat things they hear when they think nobody is listening. For days, his words followed me through the house like an echo. I heard them while watering the flowers Walter had planted years ago. I heard them while folding laundry. I heard them when I woke up in the middle of the night and stared at the ceiling instead of sleeping. A week later, Darren offered to drive me to a follow-up appointment. The visit went well. My doctor explained that while my condition required monitoring and treatment, there were encouraging signs. I listened carefully, feeling a small sense of relief. On the drive home, Darren seemed distracted. His hands tightened on the steering wheel every time the doctor mentioned improvement. At first I thought I was imagining it. Then I noticed something else. When I spoke about future travel plans or projects I wanted to complete around the house, he changed the subject almost immediately. It was subtle. Easy to miss. But once I saw it, I could not unsee it. A few days later, Monique stopped by with lunch. While we ate at the kitchen table, she casually brought up retirement communities. She spoke about them the way someone might discuss restaurants or vacation destinations. She showed me photographs on her phone. Beautiful buildings. Landscaped gardens. Comfortable rooms. Friendly staff. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I smiled politely and listened. Then she asked whether I had ever considered downsizing. The question landed differently this time. Before, I might have ignored it. Now, it felt connected to every other conversation. Every question. Every curious glance toward financial documents. Every mention of planning ahead. That evening, after she left, I walked through my house slowly. The framed family photographs. The hardwood floors Walter and I had saved years to install. The sunroom where we spent countless Saturday mornings drinking coffee together. This was not just property. It was a life. A history. A collection of memories that could never be replaced. 2 days later, I received a call from a neighbor named Evelyn. We had lived on the same street for nearly 20 years. During our conversation, she mentioned seeing Monique at a nearby senior living community. "I thought maybe you were moving," she said casually. My stomach tightened. I had never toured any facility. I had never scheduled a visit. Yet somehow Monique had been there. Asking questions. Gathering information. That night, I sat alone in my living room as rain tapped softly against the windows. For the first time, I stopped making excuses for what I was seeing. The pieces were beginning to fit together. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to make me uncomfortable. Enough to make me cautious. I looked at the family photograph above the fireplace. Everyone was smiling. Everyone looked happy. Yet suddenly the picture felt different. As though I were looking at strangers wearing familiar faces. And deep inside, a question began to grow. What exactly were they preparing for while I was still here? The next week, I stopped looking at my family the way I always had. For years, I had seen them through the lens of love. Love has a way of smoothing rough edges. It explains away behavior that should probably be questioned. It gives people the benefit of the doubt long after they have stopped earning it. Now, for the first time, I was looking more carefully. What I found unsettled me. Darren and Monique continued their campaign of kindness. The phone calls never stopped. The visits became more frequent. They offered help before I asked for it. They insisted on driving me places. They volunteered to handle errands. To anyone watching from the outside, they would have appeared to be devoted family members doing everything possible for an aging mother facing health challenges. Sometimes I almost convinced myself that my suspicions were unfair. Then another small detail would appear. One afternoon, Monique arrived while I was sorting old photographs in the den. She sat beside me and smiled warmly as we flipped through albums from decades ago. Pictures of Walter. Pictures of Darren as a child. Pictures of family vacations to Florida and South Carolina. We laughed together for nearly an hour. Then she pointed toward a photograph of the house shortly after Walter and I purchased it. "You two made a smart investment," she said. "Properties around here are worth a fortune now." I nodded. A few minutes later she asked if I had ever considered selling. "Not because of my health," she quickly added. "Just because it might be simpler." Simpler. That word stayed with me after she left. Everything seemed to be about simplifying my life. Simplifying my finances. Simplifying my responsibilities. Simplifying my future. Yet nobody ever asked what I wanted. A few days later, I visited my attorney for an unrelated matter. During our conversation, he casually mentioned that someone had recently called his office asking general questions about estate procedures. He could not disclose details, but something about the timing bothered me. I left his office with a knot in my stomach. That evening, I opened a drawer in my bedroom and removed a stack of old documents Walter had organized years ago. Insurance policies. Property records. Retirement information. As I reviewed them, memories returned. Walter had always been careful. He believed financial security was not just about money. It was about independence. "Never let anyone rush you into decisions," he used to say. "Especially when those decisions benefit them more than you." Sitting there alone, I realized how long it had been since I had followed that advice. For months, maybe years, I had allowed life to move forward without asking enough questions. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching sunlight creep across the floor. The house was quiet. Peaceful. Yet underneath that calm, something had changed. I was no longer simply receiving my family's attention. I was studying it. Listening more carefully. Watching more closely. And the more I paid attention, the more I began to suspect that my illness was not the only thing everyone had been discussing behind closed doors. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Monique called first, her voice cheerful and enthusiastic. She told me she had a surprise planned and wanted me to keep an open mind. 2 days later, Darren picked me up and drove across town without explaining where we were going. The farther we traveled, the quieter I became. When we finally turned into the entrance of a senior living community, my stomach dropped. A large stone sign stood near the road surrounded by flowers and perfectly trimmed hedges. Families walked along paved paths. Residents sat on shaded benches. Everything looked beautiful. Everything looked permanent. Darren parked the car and smiled as though he were presenting me with a gift. "Just take a look," he said. "There is no pressure." But pressure was exactly what I felt. Inside the main building, a staff member greeted us by name. By name. That detail immediately caught my attention. We had not scheduled anything together. Yet somehow they seemed to know exactly who I was. The woman led us through model apartments, dining areas, recreation rooms, and landscaped courtyards. Monique nodded approvingly at everything she saw. Darren asked questions about waiting lists, medical support, and room availability. I noticed something else. Neither of them asked what I thought. They spoke as though decisions were already being made. As though I were attending a meeting about my future rather than participating in it. During lunch in the facility dining room, Monique reached across the table and gently touched my hand. "You deserve to relax," she said. "You have spent your whole life taking care of everyone else." It sounded caring. Thoughtful even. But something felt wrong. Her eyes kept drifting toward Darren. The two of them exchanged quick glances when they thought I was not looking. Glances that reminded me of people discussing a plan. On the drive home, I remained quiet. Darren filled the silence by talking about convenience. About safety. About simplifying responsibilities. The same word again. Simplifying. That evening, after they dropped me off, I sat alone in my living room for a long time. Rain clouds gathered outside, darkening the windows before sunset. I replayed the entire day in my mind. The prepared tour. The familiar staff. The questions about room availability. The assumptions. None of it felt spontaneous. None of it felt accidental. Then the realization arrived so suddenly that I physically sat up in my chair. They had not taken me there to explore options. They had taken me there because they were already imagining a future where I no longer lived in my own home. A future they had apparently discussed in detail. I looked around the room. Walter's favorite chair still sat near the fireplace. Family photographs lined the shelves. 40 years of memories surrounded me. For the first time, I understood something painful. They were not helping me prepare for recovery. They were preparing for my absence. And that thought stayed with me long after the house went dark. Over the next several weeks, something unexpected happened. My health began to improve. The treatments were working better than my doctors had predicted. My energy slowly returned. I started taking longer walks through the neighborhood. I spent mornings tending the flower beds. I even resumed a few volunteer activities at the local library. For the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the future. Yet the stronger I became, the stranger my family's behavior seemed. When I shared positive updates, Darren's reactions felt forced. He smiled, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. Monique congratulated me, but her enthusiasm sounded rehearsed. At first I thought I was being unfair. Then the small moments began to pile up. One Sunday afternoon, I arrived at Darren's house earlier than expected for a family gathering. The front door was unlocked. As I stepped inside, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. I was about to announce myself when I heard my name. Instinctively, I stopped. "The doctor said she is improving again," Monique said. There was frustration in her voice. Not concern. Not relief. Frustration. A long silence followed. Then Darren spoke quietly. "Maybe it is temporary." My heart began to pound. I remained frozen near the entryway. "I thought things would be different by now," Monique replied. "We have been planning around this for months." Planning. The same word again. My hands tightened around my purse. Every conversation. Every question. Every visit. Suddenly they looked different. Through the kitchen doorway, I could see only part of the room. Their backs were turned. Neither knew I was there. Then Monique sighed heavily. At this rate, she will probably outlive both of us. She laughed softly. Darren did not laugh. But he did not object either. That silence hurt more than anything she could have said. I quietly stepped back outside before they saw me. I sat in my car for nearly 10 minutes staring through the windshield. The world around me continued as normal. Children rode bicycles down the street. A lawn mower hummed in the distance. Neighbors waved as they passed by. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside me. For months I had been questioning my instincts, looking for innocent explanations, convincing myself there must be another interpretation. There was not. The truth was finally impossible to ignore. They were disappointed by my recovery. Not openly. Not directly. But disappointed all the same. When I eventually entered the house, both Darren and Monique greeted me warmly. They hugged me, asked about my week, offered me a seat at the table. The performance was flawless. And that was the moment I stopped feeling hurt. Hurt leaves room for doubt. Hurt searches for excuses. What I felt now was clarity. Quiet, cold clarity. They still believed I was unaware of what was happening. They still believed I trusted them completely. I smiled through dinner. I laughed at the appropriate moments. I played my role perfectly. Because for the first time since this began, I understood something important. The masks had finally slipped. And now it was my turn to remain silent. The following Monday, I scheduled an appointment with my attorney. I did not tell Darren. I did not tell Monique. For the first time in months, I kept something entirely to myself. The office was located in a quiet brick building downtown, the same place Walter and I had visited years earlier when we first organized our estate plans. Walking through those familiar doors felt strangely comforting. Some things in life remain exactly what they appear to be. My attorney, Harold Bennett, greeted me warmly and listened without interrupting as I described everything that had happened over the previous several months. The increased attention. The questions about property. The senior living tour. The conversations I had overheard. When I finished, he folded his hands and sat silently for a moment. "You were right to come in," he finally said. That simple sentence confirmed what I already suspected. I was not imagining things. I was not being paranoid. Harold reviewed my existing documents carefully. Then he asked a question that surprised me. "Has anyone recently requested copies of your records or inquired about your accounts?" I immediately thought of the conversations that had seemed harmless at the time. The questions about my safe deposit box. The interest in my insurance policies. The repeated discussions about planning ahead. Harold nodded slowly as I answered. Before I left his office, we updated several documents and added additional protections to ensure that no significant decisions could be made without my direct approval. Everything was legal. Everything was transparent. Everything was designed to protect my independence. As I drove home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because the situation had improved, but because I finally had clarity. That clarity gave me something I had been missing. Control. During the weeks that followed, I continued behaving exactly as before. I welcomed family visits. I answered questions politely. I accepted meals and phone calls with gratitude. If Darren or Monique noticed any change in me, they never mentioned it. In fact, they seemed more confident than ever. One afternoon, while helping me organize a storage closet, Monique casually mentioned that maintaining a large house could become difficult in the future. I smiled and agreed that aging presents challenges. Her expression relaxed immediately. She thought I was still following the script she had written for me. She had no idea I was writing my own. Meanwhile, my health continued improving. My doctors were pleased with my progress. Friends commented that I looked stronger. Even my morning walks grew longer. Yet every positive update seemed to create subtle disappointment in Darren and Monique. They hid it well. Most people would never have noticed. But once you stop looking at what people say and start watching what they do, the truth becomes difficult to miss. One evening, after another cheerful family dinner, I stood alone on my back porch watching the sunset spread across the sky. The air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. For the first time since receiving my diagnosis, I was no longer afraid of what might happen next. Because I finally understood the game being played around me. More importantly, I understood that the people playing it still believed they were winning. From that point forward, I stopped trying to uncover the truth. Instead, I allowed the truth to reveal itself. It was remarkable how much people would expose when they believed they had already won. I became more agreeable, more trusting, at least on the surface. When Monique suggested helping me organize household paperwork, I thanked her. When Darren offered to accompany me to appointments, I accepted. When they discussed future plans, I listened carefully and nodded at all the right moments. The change in them was almost immediate. Their confidence grew. Their caution faded. One Saturday afternoon, I hosted a family barbecue in my backyard. The weather was perfect. Children ran across the lawn. Music played softly from a speaker on the patio. Friends and relatives filled folding chairs beneath the shade of the oak trees. To everyone else, it looked like a happy family gathering. Yet as I moved quietly through conversations, I began noticing things. Monique spoke about the house as if she already had authority over it. She discussed possible renovations with one of Darren's cousins. She talked about expanding the kitchen, replacing the flooring, updating the master bedroom. Each suggestion was presented as a joke, followed by laughter. But beneath every joke sat an assumption. The assumption that one day those decisions would belong to her. Darren was not much different. Later that afternoon, I overheard him discussing neighborhood property values with a friend. He spoke confidently about future appreciation and long-term investment opportunities. Once again, he spoke as though the house already existed in his plans. Neither of them seemed concerned that I might hear. Why would they be? They still believed I trusted them completely. During the following weeks, I noticed another change. Their patience began disappearing. The kindness remained, but it felt thinner now. Less sincere. Almost mechanical. When I mentioned signing up for a community gardening project next spring, Monique looked surprised. When I talked about a vacation I hoped to take the following year, Darren quickly changed the subject. Future plans seemed to make them uncomfortable. The farther into the future I looked, the less enthusiastic they became. One evening, Monique arrived unexpectedly with takeout from my favorite restaurant. As we ate dinner together, she brought up the senior living community again. This time she described available units and current pricing. She even mentioned that waiting too long could make it harder to secure a spot. I smiled politely and thanked her for the information. Inside, I was taking notes. Every conversation strengthened my certainty. Every suggestion revealed another piece of their expectations. They were no longer hiding their destination. Only the timetable remained uncertain. That night, after Monique left, I sat alone in the den reviewing several documents Harold had prepared. Everything was in place. Every safeguard. Every protection. Every decision rested exactly where I wanted it. For months, Darren and Monique had been building plans based on assumptions. Assumptions about my future. Assumptions about my home. Assumptions about my assets. What neither of them understood was that the foundation beneath those assumptions had already disappeared. They simply had not realized it yet. The invitation to dinner arrived 3 days later. Darren called personally and told me he wanted to celebrate my recent improvements. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Monique had planned something special, he said. Just family. Just a quiet evening together. I accepted immediately. By then, I had a strong feeling I knew exactly where the evening was heading. When I arrived at their house that Friday, everything appeared perfect. The dining room table was decorated with fresh flowers. Candles flickered softly near the center. My grandchildren were polite and unusually attentive. Even Monique seemed determined to create an atmosphere of warmth and gratitude. Throughout dinner, the conversation remained light. We talked about school activities, neighborhood news, and upcoming holidays. Everyone laughed. Everyone smiled. Yet beneath the pleasant surface, I sensed anticipation. It reminded me of a staged performance moments before the curtain rises. Eventually dessert was served. Coffee followed. Then came the moment they had been working toward for months. Darren cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair. Monique exchanged a quick glance with him before offering an encouraging smile. "Mom," Darren began carefully, "we have been talking about your future." I nodded and waited. "We only want what is best for you," Monique added. There it was. The familiar phrase. The phrase that always appeared before someone tried to make a decision on another person's behalf. Darren explained that they were worried about me living alone. He mentioned safety concerns, maintenance responsibilities, future medical needs. Everything sounded reasonable when viewed separately. Together, however, the pattern was unmistakable. Then Monique placed a folder on the table. A folder. Prepared in advance. Inside were brochures from the senior living community. Financial estimates. Suggested timelines. Notes. Detailed notes. They had not come to discuss possibilities. They had come to present a plan. Their plan. "We think this would give you peace of mind," Monique said gently. Darren nodded. "And honestly, the house is probably becoming too much to manage." Too much to manage. The same home I had maintained successfully for decades. The same home I had been caring for even while recovering. I listened quietly. The more they talked, the more confident they became. Soon they were discussing the practical advantages of selling the property. The potential value. The opportunities it would create. At one point, Monique casually mentioned how quickly homes in my neighborhood were selling. Not once did either of them ask whether I wanted to leave. They spoke as though the decision had already been made. Across the table, I noticed excitement beginning to replace caution. They believed they were finally approaching the finish line. They believed months of planning were about to pay off. I simply smiled and thanked them for their concern. Relief washed across both of their faces. They mistook my calmness for agreement. They mistook my silence for surrender. The dinner ended with hugs, warm goodbyes, and promises to continue the conversation soon. As I drove home beneath the glow of streetlights, I could almost feel their satisfaction trailing behind me. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought I was ready to sign away the future they had already spent in their minds. What neither of them realized was that the conversation they were eagerly waiting for would not unfold the way they expected. The final meeting took place 2 weeks later at Harold Bennett's office. Darren and Monique arrived looking confident. They had dressed carefully for the occasion. Monique carried a leather portfolio. Darren greeted everyone with the relaxed smile of a man who believed his future was finally falling into place. Harold welcomed us into the conference room and invited everyone to sit down. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows. The atmosphere felt calm, professional, ordinary. Yet I could sense anticipation radiating from the opposite side of the table. Darren began by explaining his concerns about my long-term well-being. Monique followed with a thoughtful speech about safety, support, and quality of life. They were polished. Convincing. If I had not known better, I might have believed every word. When they finished, Harold thanked them and opened a folder. "Before we discuss any future arrangements," he said, "Mrs. Brooks asked me to review several important updates." For the first time, I noticed uncertainty cross Monique's face. Harold calmly explained that months earlier I had updated my legal documents, reviewed my estate plans, and established new protections over all major assets. Darren sat straighter in his chair. Monique stopped smiling. Harold continued. "The house would remain entirely under my control for as long as I wished to live there. No future sale could occur without my direct authorization. No transfer could take place without my approval." Then he moved to the final document. A charitable foundation had been created in Walter's name. Upon my passing, a significant portion of my estate would fund scholarships for students from underserved communities, support local literacy programs, and contribute to causes that Walter and I had valued throughout our lives. The room became very quiet. Darren blinked several times. Monique stared at the paperwork as though she had misheard something. Harold finished speaking and folded his hands. Everything had been completed legally, transparently, and months earlier. There was nothing to challenge. Nothing to negotiate. Nothing left to assume. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Darren looked at me. "Why did you not tell us?" he asked softly. I met his eyes. "Because I needed to understand who cared about me and who cared about what I owned." Neither he nor Monique had an answer for that. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Eventually the meeting ended. There were no dramatic scenes. No raised voices. Just the uncomfortable weight of truth sitting in the middle of the room. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. My health had improved. My future remained my own. Most importantly, I no longer carried any confusion about the people around me. Some illnesses affect the body. Others reveal character. Mine did both. And in the end, the diagnosis that changed my life was not the one written in a medical chart. It was the one that showed me exactly who my family had become.